My wife passed away on a Tuesday in March, 26 years ago. I remember standing in the hospital parking lot afterward, not knowing how to drive home, not knowing how to walk back inside and tell my son that his mother was gone. Marcus was 14 years old. He looked at me with those dark, serious eyes of his, and instead of crying, he said, "Dad, we're going to be okay." I was the one who fell apart. He was the one who held us together. I want you to understand who my son was before I tell you what happened to him and what happened after, because none of what came later makes any sense unless you know the kind of man Marcus grew up to be. I spent 30 years as a general contractor in Houston, Texas. I built custom homes, commercial spaces, strip malls out on the northwest side of town. It was honest work and it paid well enough, but it was never going to make anyone rich. Marcus watched me pour concrete and pull permits and argue with inspectors his whole childhood. And somewhere along the way, he decided he was going to take everything I knew about construction and turn it into something bigger. By the time he was 32, he had his own real estate development company. Small at first, a duplex here, a converted warehouse loft there, but then the Houston market opened up like a flower, and Marcus had positioned himself perfectly. He knew which neighborhoods were turning. He knew which blocks were 3 years away from being worth triple what they were today. I used to joke that he had a compass in his chest that pointed toward value instead of north. By the time he turned 37, his company held assets worth just over $4.5 million. He had 19 properties across 3 counties. He had a staff of 6 people who loved working for him. And he had been fighting stage 3 colon cancer for 11 months. He never told me how bad it was until it was already very bad. That was Marcus. He didn't want me to worry. He kept showing up to our Sunday dinners looking a little thinner, a little tired around the eyes, and I kept telling myself it was the stress of running a growing business. I should have pushed harder. I will carry that regret for the rest of my life. When he finally sat me down and told me the full picture, the diagnosis, the prognosis, the timeline the doctors had given him, I didn't say anything for a long time. We were sitting on his back porch in the Montrose neighborhood, the same porch where he used to do his homework while I fixed things around the house on weekends. He reached over and put his hand on mine and said, almost exactly like he had when he was 14, "Dad, I need you to be strong right now, because I have some things I need to take care of, and I need to know you're with me." I told him I was with him. I told him I had always been with him. What I did not know at the time was that those words would become the foundation of a legal battle that would consume the next 2 years of my life. Sandra had been out of our lives for 8 years when my son got sick. They had met in their late 20s at a real estate conference in Austin, dated for 2 years, and then married in a small ceremony at a ranch outside of Brenham. I liked Sandra well enough in the beginning. She was sharp and ambitious, and she made Marcus laugh. But when his first development project hit serious financial trouble, a commercial renovation in the 5th Ward that went nearly $300,000 over budget, she changed. The warmth drained out of her. She started talking about protecting herself and not going down with someone else's mistakes. Marcus told me later that she had started consulting a divorce attorney before he had even finished renegotiating his bank loans. She filed 8 months after the project collapsed. By the time Marcus had rebuilt, paid back every creditor, and turned a profit, she was already remarried to a commercial banker in Dallas and had not spoken to my son in 3 years. The divorce had not been kind to Marcus financially. She had taken 30% of what he had built at the time, plus the house they shared in the Heights neighborhood, plus a lump sum settlement that had taken him 4 years to fully recover from. She had a new life. She had moved on. As far as Marcus and I were concerned, Sandra was a closed chapter. Then my son died on a Friday morning in October at Houston Methodist Hospital, with me holding his left hand and his office manager holding his right. He was 38 years old. He had fought for 14 months. He had fought quietly and fiercely and without complaint, right up until he couldn't anymore. The funeral was held the following Tuesday at a church in the Heights neighborhood, not far from the house Sandra had taken in the divorce. 300 people came. Chang Marcus had touched more lives than I ever knew. His employees, his business contacts, his neighbors. People he had coached in a volunteer youth baseball league he had joined 3 years before they all came. I stood at the door and shook hands until my palm was numb. She arrived 40 minutes into the reception. I saw her before she saw me. She was standing near the entrance of the fellowship hall, wearing black, scanning the room with an expression I can only describe as calculating, not grieving, calculating. When our eyes met, she walked toward me with her arms slightly extended, the posture of someone who has practiced appearing sincere. "Robert," she said, "I am so deeply sorry." I thanked her for coming. I kept my voice level. I had learned in 30 years of contracting that the most important thing you can do when you do not trust someone is to give them nothing to work with. She made small talk for a few minutes about what a remarkable man Marcus had been. Then, just as she was turning to leave, she said, almost as an afterthought, "I'll be in touch about some business matters. There are certain things regarding Marcus's estate that I think we should discuss. I have an attorney who believes I may have some standing." She was gone before I could respond. That night, sitting alone in my son's house, the estate had named me executor. I called Marcus's longtime attorney, a man named James, who had handled all of Marcus's real estate transactions for 5 years. James was quiet for a moment when I told him about Sandra's visit. Then he said, "Robert, there's something Marcus asked me to give you. He told me to wait until after the funeral. Can you come to my office tomorrow morning?" I was there at 8 o'clock. What James showed me changed everything. In the 6 months before he died, Marcus had done something extraordinary. Knowing that his illness was terminal, knowing that he had significant assets that certain people might try to claim, he had systematically documented everything. He had recorded video statements from his accountant, his property manager, his office manager, and 2 of his longest tenured tenants. He had obtained written affidavits about the timeline of every major asset he owned when it was acquired, with what funds, under what circumstances. He had pulled his own bank records going back 9 years and had them notarized and organized in chronological order. He had made a personal video, just him and a camera in his office, speaking directly into the lens, explaining the history of his company, the origin of every significant asset, and his clear, unambiguous intentions for his estate. He had also hired a private investigator. Months before Sandra ever showed up at his funeral, Marcus had suspected she might try something. He told James that he had seen her drive past his office building twice in the spring, shortly after news of his illness had spread through certain professional circles in Houston. He had no proof of what she was planning, but he knew Sandra, and he knew that she had retained a reputation in Houston real estate circles for aggressive financial positioning. So, he hired someone to watch. What that investigator found was damning. Sandra had been quietly in contact with a real estate appraiser named Fletcher, who had a history of inflating valuations for litigation purposes. She had also been in communication with a family law attorney in Houston, not a real estate attorney, which suggested she was exploring the argument that some of Marcus's assets might constitute marital property, despite the fact that they had been divorced for 8 years and Marcus had rebuilt his entire portfolio from scratch after the settlement. The theory, as James explained it to me, was legally thin but not impossible to make noise with. It would depend entirely on whether any of Marcus's current assets could be traced back, even loosely, to anything that predated the divorce. Marcus had anticipated this. Every single document he had gathered was designed to prove, with precision, that everything he owned at the time of his death had been built after Sandra left. Every property, every LLC interest, every dollar in his business accounts, all of it acquired after the settlement, after the clean break, after she had taken her 30% and walked away. I sat in James's office for 3 hours that morning. When I finally stood up to leave, I felt something settle in my chest. Not anger, not yet. Something quieter. The feeling of a man who has just discovered that his son trusted him completely, planned for him carefully, and left him every tool he would need. Sandra's attorney sent a formal letter 11 days after the funeral. The claim was exactly what James had predicted, a combination of arguments designed to create uncertainty around several of Marcus's largest properties. The letter suggested that 2 commercial buildings Marcus had purchased in 2019 might have involved funds that were commingled with pre-divorce assets. It requested a full accounting. It used language specifically designed to sound reasonable, while implying a much larger challenge underneath. James filed our response within a week. We attached 37 pages of documentation. What followed was 6 months of legal maneuvering that I will not describe in full detail because, frankly, parts of it were tedious even to live through. Sandra's legal team filed motions. We answered them. They requested depositions. We complied, and we submitted our own. James was methodical and unflappable, the kind of attorney who seems to operate at about half the emotional temperature of everyone else in the room. But there were moments of real ugliness. The ugliest came in February. About 4 months into the dispute, I received a phone call on a Wednesday evening from a number I didn't recognize. When I answered, the voice on the other end was Sandra's. She did not bother with pleasantries this time. She told me that she was prepared to escalate significantly, that she had information suggesting Marcus had been less than fully transparent in his final tax filings, and that unless we were willing to negotiate a settlement, she mentioned a figure of $800,000, she was prepared to make things very complicated and very public. I let her finish. I took a breath, and then I said, very calmly, that she should direct all future communications to James, and that she should be aware that our documentation was complete. Then I hung up. I called James immediately. He was quiet for a moment, then said, "Good. You didn't say anything they can use. And Robert, what she just did may have been a mistake on her part." He was right. What Sandra didn't know was that Marcus's private investigator had continued working at my request after the estate dispute began. And what that investigator had recently uncovered was that Sandra and her appraiser, Fletcher, had gone beyond merely discussing strategy. There was documented communication between them, emails, text records obtained through the legal discovery process, indicating that Fletcher had agreed to produce a fraudulent valuation of 2 of Marcus's properties for use in litigation, a number that would significantly misrepresent their actual acquisition costs and funding sources. That was not a civil matter. That was fraud. James contacted the Harris County District Attorney's Office in March. I did not know this was happening until James called me on a Thursday afternoon and simply said, "Robert, I need you to come in. There have been some developments. The discovery of the fraudulent appraisal scheme changed the nature of everything. What had been a civil estate dispute became a criminal investigation. Sandra and Fletcher retained separate criminal defense attorneys. The civil case was effectively frozen while prosecutors worked. I want to be honest with you about how I felt during that period, because I think it matters. People assume that when justice starts moving in the right direction, you feel relief. And I did feel some of that. But mostly what I felt was grief. Not anger at Sandra. By that point, my anger had burned down to something colder and quieter. Just grief. Because every step of this process reminded me that my son had anticipated it all. He had spent some of his last months on this earth, preparing for a fight he hoped would never happen. He had sat in his office, sick and tired and facing his own death, and instead of resting, he had recorded videos and organized binders and paid an investigator. Because he loved me, because he wanted to make sure I was protected. I think about that often. The civil case was resolved in August of the following year, 14 months after Marcus's funeral. The judge ruled comprehensively in our favor. Every single asset Marcus had designated in his estate, the 19 properties, the business accounts, the company equity, was confirmed as belonging to the estate and passed to me as named beneficiary. Sandra's claims were dismissed in their entirety. 2 months after that, Sandra was indicted on 2 counts of fraud in connection with the appraisal scheme. Fletcher was indicted on the same charges, plus a 3rd count related to prior fraudulent valuations in a separate case the DA's office had been building independently. I was not in the courtroom for her arraignment. I had no interest in being there. Her trial took place the following spring. She was convicted on both counts and sentenced to 4 years in state prison. Fletcher received 6. I heard about the verdict from James over the phone. I thanked him, sat down in the kitchen of my own house, and was quiet for a long time. The day after the verdict, I drove to Houston Methodist and found the oncology floor where Marcus had spent his last weeks. I found the nurse who had been with him during his final days. A woman named Carolyn, who had remembered my son because of his habit of asking the nursing staff about their families and remembering the details at the next visit. She told me something I had not known. She told me that in his last weeks, Marcus had said to her, more than once, that the thing he was most at peace with was knowing that his father was taken care of, that he had handled it, that he had made sure. I couldn't speak for a moment. She gave me a paper cup of water and sat with me in the hallway until I was ready to leave. I have been busy since then. The estate has required considerable attention. Managing 19 properties is not a small task for a 64-year-old retired contractor, even one who spent 30 years in the building trades. I brought on a property management firm that James recommended. I kept 2 of Marcus's original employees, both of whom had been with him for years and knew the portfolio better than anyone. And I did something I think would have made Marcus proud. 3 months after the civil verdict, I established a small, charitable foundation in Marcus's name. It is not a grand operation. We fund 2 things: scholarships for first-generation college students in Houston who want to study business or real estate development, and emergency grants for small contractors, people like the man I was for 30 years, who hit unexpected project overruns and are at risk of losing everything because of a single bad quarter. Marcus knew what it meant to almost lose it all. He knew what it meant to rebuild. The foundation is his legacy continuing in the way he always moved through the world. Quietly, strategically, with his eye on something worth building. I am 64 years old. I raised my son alone for 24 years after his mother died. I watched him build something remarkable from nothing. I held his hand when he left this world too soon, and then I spent 14 months fighting to protect everything he left behind. People ask me sometimes how I got through it, how I stayed calm, how I didn't fall apart. I tell them the truth. I had already been through the hardest thing. Losing him was the hardest thing. Everything after that was just work. And I know how to work. My son taught me something in the last year of his life, though he never said it directly. He taught me that the most powerful thing a person can do when they know a storm is coming is to prepare quietly, document everything, and trust the people who love them. He didn't rage against what was happening to him. He didn't spend his energy on bitterness or fear. He spent it on making sure the people he loved were protected. I think about that every morning when I wake up in the house I still own, in the city my son rebuilt his life in, surrounded by the evidence of everything he was. Sandra sat in a courtroom and tried to take what my son spent his life building. She looked at his death as an opportunity, the way some people look at every vulnerable moment as a door that might swing open if they push hard enough. She miscalculated who she was dealing with. Not just me, though. I hope she has some understanding now of what it means to come after a 64-year-old man who has nothing left to lose and every reason to fight. She miscalculated Marcus. She never understood, not in their marriage and not in that courtroom, that she was dealing with a man who thought 3 steps ahead, who prepared for contingencies she hadn't imagined, who knew exactly what she was capable of and made sure it didn't matter. He messed with the wrong family. She just didn't know it until it was too late. If you've watched this far, I want to say one more thing. I don't share this story to brag about winning. I don't feel like I won. I feel like I survived something that never should have happened. What I hope, if there's a reason to share any of this, is that someone watching might think about the people they love and whether those people are protected. Whether there are conversations you haven't had, documents that aren't in order, people in your life who know what your intentions are. Marcus protected me because he thought ahead. Not everyone has a son like that. But everyone can start a conversation. If this story meant something to you, I'd ask you to leave a comment and let me know. Tell me about someone in your life who fought quietly and protected the people they loved. And if you're new here, welcome. There are more stories coming. Stories about ordinary people who refuse to stay down. Subscribe so you don't miss them. Until next time, take care of each other.